I want to welcome you to Making Faithful Decisions at the End of Life. As we know who the real MVP is. It's always Gerald. And so thank you to Gerald for her work in pulling together a really wonderful 4-part series that we are engaged in starting today and then 3 weeks following today. I want to give you a little bit of a roadmap for where we're going. This is I like to do that so that you feel compelled to come back. It's worth coming back for. So I will introduce Nancy Duff in a minute. She is a retired professor from Princeton Theological Seminary, and she is going to ground us theologically today and next week on the topic of death and dying, making good decisions. This week, we're going to talk about our understanding of death. And then next week, we'll talk about grief and lamentation. So our response to death. And that'll be theological and practical in nature, some things to say and not to say to folks who are in grief. That's our first 2 weeks. Then you're stuck with me the week after that, but we're getting practical. At that point, we're going to talk a little bit about how to plan a funeral, what that looks like. And so hopefully that will be substantive theologically as well. It'll be a time to I'll invite you to do some reflecting on what Nancy has shared with us over the last 2 weeks, as well as to start thinking about what a funeral is, how you might like to be remembered, how you might like your loved ones to worship God on the occasion of your death. That is the 3rd week. And then we'll briefly touch on some more practical things. We've got a document here about kind of making plans for end of life that is very, very practical. So we'll talk about that in the 3rd week. And then in the 4th week, Chuck is going to host a speaker from hospice. He's going to talk a little bit about end of life decision making, what is palliative care, and dignity at the end of life. And so that's going to be worth tuning in for. That's the Sunday right before Thanksgiving. So I hope you've marked your calendars for those things. Let me introduce our speaker, and then I'm going to pass it off to you somehow, Nancy, if she's up here in the top right corner. Nancy Duff is the Stephen Colwell Associate Professor of Christian Ethics Emerita at Princeton Theological Seminary. After almost 30 years of teaching Christian ethics and theology at the seminary, she retired in December 2020. Congratulations to you. For many years, Nancy taught a course on the ethics of resisting and accepting death. Beyond the classroom, she has served on the ethics committee of the local hospital for over 25 years. Imagine that work. And then in 2018, Nancy published a book called Making Faithful Decisions at the End of Life. And we have unashamedly stolen your title for our series. So thanks for unwittingly lending that to us. Many of the ideas in her presentation this week and next week are drawn from that book. And she hopes also to work on a companion book, Living Faithfully into Older Age. Here is a cool tidbit. She was a student intern at First Presbyterian Church in Charlotte in 1975 and 1976 under the supervision of Carswell Hughes. So that's a neat connection that we have with Nancy, and she and her husband, David Mertz, who I think is on here. I love when married couples zoom in from different rooms. He's a retired pastor in the United Methodist Church. And so welcome to you, David. We're glad to have you as well. And together they live in East Windsor, New Jersey. And with that, let's welcome Nancy.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. David and I look forward to someday when we can drive to North Carolina. I'd love to see that church again after all these years. And we have other friends in North Carolina, including Robert Galloway and his parents, Bunny and Lewis. We were all in seminary together. So someday we hope to come back, but thank God for Zoom that we can do some things that we otherwise couldn't do. What I'm going to screen share here, I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Let's see, play from start. So this explains this week, we're going to talk about our understanding of death. And I'm going to cover 3 things. Why we need to talk about death, how to prepare for our own deaths, just a very brief word about burial and funerals. You're going to do that later, and the need to have advanced directive living will. And then the Christian perspective on death, that it's something that we are to resist and accept. Oops. So we need to talk about death. And to introduce us to that topic briefly, we're going to see this little clip. So part of obviously what that is just a string of euphemisms that we use for death. And I do want to say, I don't think there's always something wrong with using a euphemism. So sometimes it's just a gentler thing to say, he passed away. We don't always have to say the starker words, he died, she died. But I think the point of that clip from Monty Python is really that, sometimes we're just trying to avoid talking about death at all, that we can't say the parrot is dead. I'm sorry that I have changed the screen there, not meaning to. So we need to talk about death, and it's something that people understandably don't want to talk about, but I have been on the ethics committee for a number of years, and we hear cases after the fact, usually, sometimes ongoing cases, but some of the ones that stand out the most significantly for me are those where there was just such bad family communication. Even though the patient may have been dying for a long time, there was never that conversation about death. In fact, there was an attempt to avoid it. We need to talk to our family about our wishes, have a living will, advance directive. Technically, those mean something slightly different, but we use them interchangeably now. But you also have to talk to people about it. You can't just fill out a living will and say, I'm done. You need to talk to significant people, especially the person you choose as the surrogate decision maker. And I really, I want to encourage churches to make church a safe place for people to talk about death, and especially their fears. I talked to an older woman once who said she'd never been afraid of death, but now she found out that she was, because she knew that she had only a few years left. But she thought she couldn't talk about her fears in church. She was afraid somebody would judge her for having weak faith. And I just want to encourage people to think of the church. It should be the safest place that we can talk about what we want when we anticipate our own deaths, what we would like to happen, but also what we're afraid of. And even if things that we thought were firmly part of our belief, our faith, maybe we're doubting those things now. And I would like people in the church to be able to talk about those things to each other. See, I can't see my whole screen is why I'm squinting here. We need to prepare for our own deaths. I want to encourage you to look up a book that I have. What will happen if I X that out? Bought. It's called I'm Dead, Now What? My Husband and I, by Peter Pauper Press. My husband and I bought this a few months ago, and in this book, all the things that people would need to know after you're gone can be recorded, so that all these bills need to be paid, and these things need to be tended to, and these are the people that you need to contact. An enormous amount of information. David and I are still working on it because it is so much, but I really encourage you. This would be such a gift to the people who need to take care of things after you've died. Leave instructions for your burial. Do you want to be cremated? Do you want to be buried without cremation? Do you have a plot? David and I bought a cemetery plot a long time ago, just one plot. We could bury 2 cremains. So, our children need to know, they do know we have that. Where's the paperwork that says that we own it? Planning your own funeral, you'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. It can be an enormously helpful thing for families. Some people want to go, well, it's not about me, it's about people who are left. They can do whatever they want. But it can be so hard for a family member to have to plan the funeral in the midst of grieving. You can say, all these are suggestions. If you don't have really firm conviction about it has to be that way, or you could say, I really want this. David and I know a man who was a musician. He knew he was dying. His music tastes were very sophisticated, and he didn't like praise music. And finally, a friend of his, he wouldn't talk about what he wanted for his funeral. And finally, she said, listen, we're going to have nothing but praise music at your funeral if you don't talk to me. And so he did. And he said the kind of music that he wanted. And it was very meaningful to those of us who knew him, because we knew the music was something that he loved. And then finally, advance directive, living will. Really would encourage you to fill one out. If you haven't, there's one for each state. Each state requires something a little bit different. But in an advance directive, the most important thing you do is choose a surrogate decision maker, somebody to make decisions when you can't. And you need to designate them, only one person. It's really complicated if two people are identified. You do identify a second, but only one, and talk to the person that you are designating as surrogate so that they can't understand everything that you want just by reading the document. So I encourage you, if you haven't planned or written down what you want for those three things, that's something that would be a tremendous gift to people who are left to tend to things after you pass away. And then finally, what we want to talk about, I may be talking a little bit too fast. I want to leave time for conversation, so I'm going to slow down just a little bit. I think as Christians, we need to consider death in two ways. And some of this is, I think the Bible teaches us this. On the one hand, death is the enemy to be resisted, that it is something that we fight against and we want to affirm life. And on the other hand, though, death is part of human mortality and it has to be accepted. So I think that we hold to both of those theological claims, and then in each situation, we decide which is true at that particular moment. This is an image of death we're all familiar with. The Grim Reaper has a scythe in its hand, which is meant to be harvesting souls. But as I read about the history of this, it became very popular during the Black Death in the Middle Ages when so many people were dying. It is a frightening figure. It's ominous and intentionally so. But it also, I didn't know this till I began to read about it, it's been interpreted in two different ways. And the first is, the only thing I thought that it meant, that that's death that's approaching people and harvesting that person's soul, causing death. And so it means that, but also some people interpret it to mean, no, it's not the angel of death. It is the specter that comes, death has already occurred, and the Grim Reaper comes and reaps the soul of the person who's already died, and then travels with that soul in a boat across the river to the other side. Now, that's not the way Christians view death, but what interested me as I looked at this is that it had both those meanings. And that's partly what I'm wanting to talk about, that death is the enemy, that this figure of death, something that frightens us, and we fight against it. We want to keep death at bay as long as we can and in every way that we can. But on the other hand, death is also something that's going to happen to all of us, and that we have to accept it. And in Christian, rather than the view of being carried across the boat, Christian understanding is that there is resurrection after that we die. Now, I still think both of those views are frightening. I'm not saying death is scary in the one hand and not so scary in the other, but it does for Christians have those two meanings. Death is something to be fought against, and death is something that we have to accept. So a little bit, death is the enemy to be resisted. Death joins sin and the powers and principalities. That's Paul in Romans. What can separate us from the love of God? Neither life nor death, nor powers and principalities. So that this is what Tom Long, a well-known teacher of preaching, he calls this capital D death. Death with a capital D is almost a force that can join sin and something that we fight against with the powers and principalities. Death is something that steals life, that's against life, even if we're not facing a terminal illness. Death with a capital D is a force to be reckoned with. It's death in war. During the pandemic, it's death that comes in and snatches away people's lives who thought that they still had a great deal of time to live, but it's also the attitudes, the indifference sometimes against people who are dying, that we're falling into this double nature of death joined with sin. It captures territory. Where we lived, what we thought we still had that would be defined as life is now being captured by death with a capital D. So we resist this, we resist death. I should have put that, death with a capital D, in every aspect of life as we're living, and then also as we face life-threatening illness. Our first and appropriate response is, if we're told we have a life-threatening illness or somebody else does, is what can we do to stave that off? What sort of treatments might cure us of the disease, or at least might extend our life in a meaningful way? So that's one really significant. Death is the enemy to be resisted. But the other, death has to be accepted as part of human mortality. I believe the Bible teaches us that we're both created, so the creation story, and saved. And we think about the incarnation, that God became incarnate in Jesus Christ, is part of the significance of bodily life being affirmed, but also becoming mortal. Now, the creation story can be sort of confusing, because we read the creation story that Adam and Eve weren't created mortal. A lot of people interpret that story, but it was only death became the consequence of sin, and only then did they have a limited mortal life. I think there's another way that you can read that. When they're driven from the garden because they've sinned, God says, puts an angel in front of the gate of the garden, says, lest they come back and become like us, eat from the tree of life and come like us. In other words, lest they come back in the garden, eat from the tree of life and become mortal. So become immortal, which says to me that at least that part of the creation story is saying they were created mortal. They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, were expelled from the garden, and they can't come back and eat from the other tree where they would become immortal. I don't think it really matters, my interpretation and some others, and the one that would say, no, they were created and they wouldn't have died. It still is that we're mortal human beings, whether that's the way God originally created humanity, or it's now because death is joined with sin. We're mortal, and we may keep trying not to accept that, but finally, of course, everyone, each of us is going to die. And I think we're also saved as mortal human beings. And refusing to accept our mortality it's a form of idolatry. Some people do terrible things to try to keep from being reminded that eventually they're going to die. Insisting that everything be done when death is imminent for a patient, I think, is refusing to accept our mortality. I've already said, I think our response is right with access to medicine, that everything be done to try to stave off this life-threatening illness. But there comes a point where that sometimes that's not possible anymore. And I know from the ethics committee, and you may know situations in your own life where even when it's very clear the patient is dying, more treatment is demanded. They keep, well, let's try the next experimental treatment, or let's try this. And the patient never is allowed to accept the fact that he or she is dying, and neither does the family. The worst case that we had about that when I'm on the ethics committee was a woman. She'd been taking care of her husband for many, many years. She knew all about his treatment. And she'd been told many times he was going to die, and he left the hospital. But finally, he was in the local hospital. It was absolutely clear he was dying. His body was already breaking down to the point where the smell of death filled the room. It was very hard for nurses and staff to go in there, but the woman kept insisting that they do everything, that they keep all of the treatment he'd always had. They could have said no. Doctors could say, and nurses, I can't do this, somebody else will have to, but they didn't want to abandon him. And finally, he did die. I think that what that woman was doing, I don't know if she was religious, Christian or not, but she couldn't accept the mortality of her husband. The nursing staff felt like they were assaulting this body. And it's also that's an extreme case of where we finally need to accept somebody as having value, but now address them as somebody who is dying, who isn't going to survive the illness. But I do want to say what accepting death does not mean. And this has crept into some Christian funerals and Christian thought, that it's kind of an easy or casual acceptance of death, or even the claim that death is beautiful. So some people want to compare death as natural as the changing of the seasons. So, we go from spring to summer to fall to winter, and we die just like the leaves fall from a tree. And I find that sort of offensive. My mother lived till almost 90, but her death wasn't beautiful. It wasn't like, well, now she's entered the winter years of her life and she can pass away the way a leaf falls from a tree. I don't grieve the leaves falling. I may feel this sort of sense that we do in the fall, that summer is passing, but I grieved over my mother's death, and it wasn't beautiful. Death is like a garden door is a very well-known, often used poem by Nancy Bird Turner, where she says, willing and weary feet walk to that door, nothing to trouble any heart. You just walk through it very peacefully. And another poem by Mary Elizabeth Fry, do not stand at my grave and weep. I did not die, I do not sleep. When I stand at somebody's grave at a funeral, they died. I just think we can't say they didn't die. It's sort of like responding to Paul's, "O death, where is thy sting?" That should say it. These poems are just saying, actually, death doesn't have a sting. It's just something gentle that happens to us. The Bible never says death is beautiful. And I think that these kinds of casual acceptance of death doesn't help somebody as they're dying. If they just have a lot of things on their mind, maybe some of it is fear and they need to talk about it. And I don't think it's good for people who are grieving. Death isn't easy. Even if we come to a point where we know this person's time to die has arrived and they accept it and we accept it, it's still not just a casual or easy thing to accept. So I'm wanting to say, for encouraging Christians to hold on to both. Death is the enemy to be resisted, and death is part of human mortality to be accepted. And so if we hold to both of those, it's in every situation we're in. If we're talking about somebody who's ill, is this a situation where we would ask ourselves, we continue to resist death, to do all we can to keep someone alive, and there are situations where that is the appropriate response? Or do we accept that death is imminent, that this person's time to die has arrived, however untimely that death may be, and that we must treat this person as someone who's dying and allow that person to die? It can be exhausting for someone who has a terminal illness. The person knows that he or she is dying, but also knows that there's this expectation to keep trying, keep up good spirits and hope, and keep fighting this disease, even to the point where it's an impossible goal. So part of what I'm saying, ethics is contextual, that we know, do we fight against death or do we have to accept death in this situation? We can't just say beforehand what decision we're going to make, but it's in each particular case. Do we continue to fight against death, or is it time now to accept that death is immediate? And if it interests you, we could talk about what are the markers? How would we tell that it's gone from the first to the second? When someone is near the end of life, then I would want to affirm that Christians insist on the importance of bodily life. I think that we're wrong. We certainly hope in the resurrection. We believe that death does not have the last word, and that there is life beyond this life, even recognizable life of a resurrected body. We affirm that, but we don't. We have to resist reducing life to an animated body. So sometimes the illness, a person is now permanently unconscious, they'll never come to, and they're being kept alive by machines. And for me, that life itself has been reduced to a body, that they're no longer, we're no longer considering that they're a whole person with body and soul and emotions, physical and psychological. I would encourage us to say life has meaning even when life is coming to an end. So I wouldn't want to be misunderstood to say that once we decide we're not going to keep fighting death, we have to accept that death is imminent. We're not deciding that because that person's life no longer has value, but rather we treat this as a valuable person, a valuable life, but now someone who is valuable but facing death. I think there comes a point where it is respectful to treat that person with compassion, find out what they need to talk about, as we admit that there's nothing that we can really do. Their life is coming to an end. And the last is praying for a miracle shouldn't keep us from faithfully preparing for death. People pray for miracles. I'm not against that. But sometimes they can't allow, I've seen this in some of the cases at the hospital, they can't accept, if I accept that the person is dying, then my faith is going to be weak, and my prayer for a miracle may be weak too, may not happen. And I keep praying for a miracle, but also we don't know if God's going to answer that prayer the way that someone wants. Hopes that they will. And so at the same time, prepare for death. One woman she talks about when she was pregnant, they diagnosed her unborn child with a malady that meant the child was not going to be able to survive. If born, it would only live, he or she would only live for a very short time. And she said she appreciated it when friends would say, oh, I'm praying for a miracle. She actually, that felt supportive, and she was glad for Christians to be saying that, but she said she couldn't. She said she couldn't pray for a miracle and prepare to be a mother to a child who wasn't going to live very long. She needed to put her energies and emotions on the ladder. So consider the relationship between praying for a miracle and yet still at some point accepting that death is imminent. And then finally, death is just a difficult part of life. We may very well readily admit we know we're mortal, but it can frighten us. Some studies show that some people are more afraid of dying than they are of death itself, because they know what might happen in the hospital, that they might die in a way that they wouldn't wish. And some people find themselves afraid of death. I know I keep emphasizing fear, but it's because I so want people to be able to talk about it. One of my best friends from college died, excuse me, this past beginning of the year. He'd been a pastor for over 30 years. He was retired, but everything that he had, all those years assured for others that death doesn't have the last word. He found that he had doubts. He wasn't sure that he actually could believe that when he himself was dying. I know he talked to his family about it, and he talked to me because we were very good friends, and he knew that I wouldn't judge him as, oh, are you kidding? You've been believing this all these years and now you can't. But instead we talked about it, and I could assure him I didn't have those doubts. I still firmly believe this. And I do think that he died back to his confidence that death doesn't have the last word. And again, I know he talked to his family about it. And I just think how horrible if there are people in the church who don't have anybody that they can talk to when they're dying, to express those kind of fears and get the kind of reassurances that they need. I think we can be afraid of what kind of pain is going to be involved, or other things that can happen to you where we're dying. And so one of the things that we'll talk about this next week when we turn to grief and lamentation is to be there for one another, to give one another comfort. But we do that in the context of comfort that comes from God. So this is the first question of the Heidelberg Confession. What is your only comfort in life and in death? And the answer is that I am not my own, but belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. So that I hope we can encourage each other in that faithful statement as we consider and face our own deaths. So I've left some time for us to have a discussion. If you have questions or comments you want to make, and I hope anybody will feel free to disagree with anything I said if you don't agree. But if we can spend the last, I think, 20 minutes we have in conversation.
And I would invite you either to raise your hand if you're in the classroom, put it in the chat, or use the raise hand button, and I'll help Nancy sort of pick out some questions. Hal, it looks like you had a question.
Yeah, I was going, this has been great, thank you. And you offered to give us some markers to help us understand when we go from resisting death to accepting mortality. And that would be very helpful.
I think I did word it that way. What I meant to say is, let's talk about what you think those markers are, but I'm not trying to screw up. I really want to acknowledge that that can be incredibly difficult. And I think that's the first thing we have to acknowledge. So I have a very good friend whose husband he wasn't going to make it after surgery. They couldn't even do the surgery because his heart reacted terribly to the anesthesia. He had a heart condition they didn't know about. And even with her deciding to withdraw life support, these are some of the things that she thought about. He would be in excruciating pain for the rest of his life, in part because his hip was giving him that pain. And anything else that happened to him, he could never have surgery. He couldn't have anesthesia. He would always be confined to a wheelchair, which in itself is not a reason not to try to keep living. But she just kept thinking of all the things that were going to happen because he couldn't have that surgery. And she knew that was clear. She knew that he wouldn't have wanted to continue living that way. But it's still, and this is important to consider, it wasn't easy for her to decide. His niece was there, and together it took her a few days to be able to say, I know this is not what he would want. And now every year she and that niece are on the phone for those minutes or however long it took after they withdrew life support and he passed away. So I'm saying that for two reasons. Even when you're sure, and she was sure this was what he would want, it isn't easy. But some of the markers I gave there is if the person is never going to be able to deal with the pain because treatment isn't working. Now, some people will choose permanent. I call it terminal. A lot of people do sedation. They can sedate you and you're unconscious until you die. They can also bring you back to talk to some people and then sedate you again if the pain is too bad. That is a really good option for some people. It's not for me. And it wasn't for Brittany Maynard, who was in a very public way in 2017, or I forget the year, with brain cancer, chose medical aid in dying. But that's another reason you need to know the person's wishes. Those things need to be written down and talked about in a living will. Do you have some ideas of what those markers might be for you?
Just based on family experience, obviously, if someone is unconscious and really has no ability to interact with other people, that would be one. Another is someone whose quality of life, even though they are conscious, as you were saying in your instance, is so bad that they really can't enjoy life and participate with people they love.
So those would be things to consider. There's an essay in the New York Times, 100 things that is in the title, I forget it, but this man said when he first had a terminal illness diagnosis, he listed 100 things that life wouldn't be worth living without these things. And the more he moved, so they were taken away, the more he thought, well, I can live without doing that. I can live without doing that. But finally, when he got let down, he knew to the last 3 to 5 things, life wasn't going to be living anymore. For one woman in a medical situation, it was that she would never again be able to get up and feed her family, cook for them. Now, that wasn't the sole reason that she didn't want treatment to continue, but it was the last, when that was something that, of all the things that had been taken away from her, that one tipped the scales, that she just couldn't lead life in the condition that she would be left with.
Randy. Oh, yes. Randy.
Yeah.
Randy, did you have a question? Others of you, David.
Do you think that humans will ever treat each other as well as we treat our pets?
It's actually a wonderful question, and people say that when we keep extending somebody's life when they're dying, and all we're doing is extending their death, they're dying, and it's not a good dying. And there are people who've said, I treated my dog or my cat better than this, because we humanely, once life was no longer good for that pet, we let them die. Now in New Jersey, medical aid in dying has just passed. And so there is the option for, if you're terminal, 6 months prognosis to live, you can request assistance in dying. Now, in this country, nobody can give you an injection or any way directly assist you, but you get a lethal dose of drugs that you mix, and you have to be able to administer it yourself. So some people, like people with ALS, by the time they're 6 months from death, they can't do that anymore. But I think that it's a good, we're not animals. Nobody's suggesting that when they raise that question, but they're just saying sometimes we seem to treat our dying animals better than we treat our human loved ones and patients. One of the things is y'all are thinking about, if you have other questions, that if in person, and I meant to say this in the beginning, I might have, and I'll do this again next week, pass cards around and had you say what scares me the most about death, or what you hope can happen before you die. Somebody wrote on the side of a barn one time that was near a highway after her father died, and she was just trying to communicate with other people, express herself, and she said, before I die, I want to. And people, it was such a situation, could come up and write what they wanted. So consider, before you die, what do you hope that you can do? I'm not asking you to answer that now, but just to think about that. Or you can, if you want.
Paige.
Hope you can hear me. One of my fears is my parents lived to be 90, both of them. They had very poor health. They did not, they both had Parkinson's disease. They were at a retirement center in healthcare. And every time any little thing happened at that age, they were sent to the emergency room. And I feel like the healthcare center is trying to cover themselves liability-wise by always sending them off to a hospital. And it was awful, because they would be put in an emergency room and lie there, and it could be in the middle of the night. And then they come back and they're not, they can't do anything for them. So that's my big fear, to grow old and be at a retirement center, healthcare, and just lie there day after day and not die. I mean, unfortunately, we just can't die in our sleep anymore, like we used to do.
So I want to be sure, Nancy, could you hear that question?
I think I got most of it, and it is something, if I can bring my attention back sometime to this next project, Living Faithfully into Older Age, what's available to people in this country if they have dementia, if they have Parkinson's, if they need any kind of residential care when they're older. We need to do better. And it's tragic. And I think you're probably right that they were protecting themselves. And I'm very sympathetic that doctors and healthcare workers and institutions, they can't be indifferent to lawsuits, legal challenges, but that shouldn't dictate care. And what you're saying is actually your parents were getting worse care when they were sent to the hospital. And we can try to look carefully for an institution that wouldn't do that and ask those, but I have a experience with family members and Alzheimer's, and you spend an enormous amount of money for something that you can't call excellent care. So at a policy and level, as a society, we need to do better. are there things that we personally can do when you write out what your wishes are that you don't want that to happen to you? It at least would be very important to write that down so that if there was any way somebody could keep that from happening, they would try to.
Jean?
I used to work in medical ethics in the state of North Carolina. Now there is a law called Medical Care for Advanced Directives. And when you enter into a long-term care facility, you are supposed to sign that now, saying, I do not want to be transported to the hospital. I don't want to be resuscitated. And that's on your medical records. So you wouldn't be transported if you have signed that or your family member.
I think that's great. I'm sure it goes by different names. And in New Jersey, I'm sure that's the same thing. We call it POLST, which is physician orders for whatever, but it's like a living will, but it's more for, in that case, if you were transferred from, if you did have to go to the hospital and back to the care center, it would go with you, it travels with you, and it's more updated than a living will might be. You sign that with a medical person talking to you at the time of coming in, of being admitted to the care center. So if you're looking up advanced directives, you might also, what did you say it was called there?
I think it's called, instead of physician care, it's medical care. So practitioners and physician assistants can sign
Right.
the order.
Which I think is true in New Jersey too. It says physicians, but anyway, that's a very important document to be aware of in terms of knowing that you can write down your wishes.
And I would add that Nancy was kind enough to send us a long list of resources, and I have put those on the fpcpathways.com website. It's under, you can go to the end of life, and the link to POST, the New Jersey program that Nancy mentioned is there. There's a couple of videos, a list of books that Nancy provided. So I encourage you to go there, and we'll continue to add resources over the course of this study. So
Reference to that essay that's available online, 100 Things to Do Before I Die, or something like that, is on there. As is, there are these 10 tools that I found online for filling out a living will. David and I, the one that we liked the best was I filled out all these questions as if he were answering, and he filled them out as if I were answering. We've been married over 30 years and we didn't get it all right. Sometimes we did, but it was like, what are you most afraid of? We each answered that one incorrectly. So it was very helpful just to get us to talk about it as we were filling out our living wills.
David.
Nancy, well, I agree with you that euphemisms for death are less harsh in certain circumstances. I am generally not a big fan, mostly for clarity. And it is, in my experience, I've seen these things posted on social media where someone's trying to let their friends and family know that someone's died, and they never say that they've died. They never allude to the fact that they've died. They just say glowing things about a person. And when you read that post, you go, has the person moved, or are they taking a trip abroad, or what is happening here? And there's no clarity with that. So gosh, when I posted something about my brother's death, I said, I'm terribly sad my brother has died, and here's what I want you to know about that. And I thought
I completely agree. The reason why I backed off a little bit from my own rejection of euphemisms, when I was teaching class, and I said that, a student from the Black church tradition, she said, that's what we say, he passed. That was just their word, and that's not actually skirting, it's just the word they use for he died. So I wanted to allow for that. And there are occasions where it just seems like the person I'm talking to say he passed away is a little bit gentler, always the stark he died. But I agree with you, a lot of the euphemisms are just trying to avoid the fact of saying he died. You need to look into social media. I still get friend requests from a friend of ours who died several years ago. There is a way that you can go into Facebook and set it up to be, I forget what it's called, a legacy account. So if you want it kept, or somebody can do away with it if you want that. But that's another thing that would be really good to take care of now if you have a Facebook page.
I noticed that hospitals frequently use the term expired, which I'm not sure expiration for life is the right terminology.
So do lawyers say that. I don't know why he died isn't appropriate and you need to say expired. I don't like that either. And I'm not quite sure why that becomes the language at some point.
Is there anybody on Zoom who has a question? I'd be glad to hear from you all.
I just want to pick up on a couple things Nancy said that I think, like she said, we did this, I answered questions for her and she answered questions for me, and we didn't get them all right. But I guess just, and we don't do this as much as we should, and we need to get back to this now, that especially since we've shifted into retirement mode. But I heard at least 3 kind of lists that she suggested we might put together, or at least use as talking points. And one is this list from the New York Times: what are things that I can't live without? Another, what do I hope to do or to be before I die? And the other would be, what are things that scare me the most? And at a minimum, these are all kind of talking points that we can use either as just family members or in a Sunday school class or whatever the context might be. But I think as family and in church, those are all kind of 3 kind of really important lists, if you will, that would all lend themselves to really good conversation.
So an example of that, everybody's afraid of the feeling of not being able to breathe. That would be at the top for me. And I would want the people to know I have claustrophobia. If, any way I'm going to feel confined and be aware of it. Somebody else's biggest fear is I'm going to be in pain. Well, we're all afraid of being in terrible pain, but it's still that you would say that's the thing you fear the most. So I agree with David that those are really good talking points, those 3 things. What do you fear, hope, and what do you want to do before you die?
Barb, you had a question?
Well, it's not a question, it's really a story. I have a good friend who, 58 years old, who is dying. She found out in September that 3 different aches and pains in her body was of cancer, and it's incurable. She tried radiation and chemotherapy, and it didn't work. And she and her husband made the decision, or she made the decision, to stop all of that and just, stop treatment, and knowing that death is coming. And I don't know if it's out of her Quaker background, but just a really solid, joyous end of life, if I can say. She's inviting friends over to talk. She wants to connect with her daughters. She wants to do a lot of things, and we're all kind of grieving at this point before she's dying, but I think it's healthy. I think we're all supporting her with meals and different things, and it just seems like the community is coming around her. And positive way, I think, of having turned that focus now to making sure that everything leading up to death is as full as possible.
I love that. I know we're just a minute away here. When I say death is not beautiful, that doesn't mean that beautiful things can happen when someone is dying. And when my friend who died this year, his wife died ahead of him, and she finally went on hospice. They knew that cancer, it wasn't going to go away. And they said one of the first things they noticed is that they weren't spending all this time, hours every week, sitting in doctor's waiting room, that she got to be at home, wonderful care with family. I got to go visit her. So incredible things can happen in that time when we just know treatment's not going to help. I don't want to keep fighting it. I fought the good fight, and now I just want to be with my friends and family. So some of those things you described are indeed beautiful, even if I'm saying that death itself, the Bible doesn't tell us, is a beautiful thing.
Well, I think that is a good stopping point. Barb, thank you for that story. So Nancy, thank you very much for today. We will look forward to seeing you back next week and hope all of you will be back. And I encourage you to go to the Pathways to Discipleship page and see what resources are there and work through some of these things as David and Nancy have suggested. So thank you all for
so much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. I've loved being with you.
glad to have you.